I heard that sentence right in the middle of dinner, and my heart felt as if someone had crushed it in their fist. Natalie was smiling gently at her husband, but in a very soft Portuguese voice, she told the man sitting across from us that everything was already prepared, and that I still had no idea what was coming. Graham Pierce remained seated, his back straight, his hands steady on his knife and fork, as if nothing had happened. No one in that harborside restaurant in Vancouver knew that in a single moment my entire life had been torn away from the peaceful illusion I had been living in. 33 years of marriage, a family I believed was solid, suddenly revealed itself as a carefully staged performance. And I, the man everyone saw as retired, outdated, and harmless, was the most underestimated character in that play. Natalie Pierce, my wife, sat across from me looking every bit the successful executive. The warm light reflected off her carefully made-up face, her black dress, hugging her figure in a way that made her look younger than her age. She leaned subtly toward Dante Moretti, the chief operating officer of Northbridge, and her direct superior, the man she had introduced as an important business partner. The space between them was dangerously small, but Natalie called it professional courtesy. I had believed her. I had always believed her. For years I had been a man content to stay in the background. I once managed international port operations and made decisions worth millions of dollars, but after retiring early following a workplace accident, I willingly stepped aside. I tended the garden, brewed coffee every morning, and let Natalie soar in her career. Friends saw me as a gentle husband, a little invisible. Natalie saw me that way too, and Dante certainly did. There was only one thing neither of them knew. I understood every word Natalie had just spoken. I had lived for years in Madeira while overseeing a European port project, and Portuguese had entered my life not through textbooks, but through storms, late-night negotiations, and moments where a single mistake could have cost lives. It was a quiet power I had never shared with Natalie, and tonight, that silence was protecting me. Natalie laughed, a sound that once warmed me, but now made my stomach tighten. Dante raised his wine glass and glanced at me with thinly veiled condescension, asking politely if I was enjoying the atmosphere. I nodded and answered slowly, playing the role of a retired husband who did not understand the sophisticated world his wife now inhabited. Inside my mind, thoughts were racing. I remembered how Natalie had recently started mentioning my health in front of others, saying I was forgetful and tired. I remembered the late nights she blamed on urgent meetings, and now, in a language they believed I did not understand, she had confirmed that something was ready. This was not a careless affair, not a moment of weakness. It was a plan. Dante leaned closer to her and spoke quickly, mentioning timing, patience, and the certainty that I would not realize anything until it was too late. My hand tightened beneath the table, my joints aching with tension, but my face remained calm. I cut my food and chewed slowly, like a man who heard nothing beyond the soft jazz playing in the background. Natalie glanced at me, and in her eyes I no longer saw the woman I married, but an actress checking whether her audience still believed her role. I smiled back a smile, just harmless enough, just foolish enough. I knew I was being underestimated, and for the first time in years, I understood that this was my greatest advantage. Dinner went on with talk of projects, opportunities, and a bright future waiting for Natalie. I listened, but inside me a decision was taking shape. I would not confront her, not yet. I would not explode, and I would not panic. If Natalie and Dante thought I was nothing more than an aging man waiting for time to erase him, they were wrong. When I stood to pull out Natalie's chair, I caught my reflection in the restaurant window. I was a betrayed husband, yes, but I was also a man who had once guided massive ships through open seas. And if this was a game of chess, then the opponent they were facing was not a pawn. This was only the first move. Natalie's laughter lingered just a little too long, too perfectly rounded, as if she were sealing a secret that had just been successfully confirmed. Graham felt the air around the table thick and heavy, like the sea fog at dawn, the kind that once forced massive ships to slow down and made the man in command strain his eyes until they burned. Dante was the one who broke the silence. He spoke about strategy, about growth, about new shipping routes that would unlock enormous profits. His voice was confident and clipped the sound of a man accustomed to standing above others and issuing orders. Natalie listened with her whole body leaning subtly toward him, her eyes lighting up, her lips curving slightly with every word. To Graham, this was no longer professional admiration. It was the intimacy of two people sharing a secret. Graham took a slow sip of water. In his mind, fragments of memory began assembling on their own. The nights Natalie came home late, a foreign perfume lingering on her collar. The phone calls she took on the balcony, her voice lowered, ending abruptly when she noticed him nearby. And the comments she had made so casually to friends, saying Graham had been forgetful, lately tired, not as sharp as he used to be. He had brushed it off, believing it was nothing more than the clumsy concern of a busy wife. Now each of those words turned into a thin blade, slicing through his understanding of the past. Natalie turned to Graham and placed her hand over his. The gesture was familiar, gentle, but Graham felt the control in it, as if she were reminding him of his role. "I know you do not like these kinds of dinners," she said, her concern flawless. "But for our future, just try a little harder." Graham nodded. He looked into her eyes, searching for the woman who had once held his hand through their hardest years. All he found was a cold emptiness. Dante watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. In his mind, Graham was nothing but a shadow, a man who had left the game long ago and now existed only in name. A small obstacle that would soon be moved aside in the cleanest way possible. Dante prided himself on judging people within seconds and assigning them their place. With Graham, he had misjudged. Dinner moved on to the main course. Cutlery struck porcelain with dry, hollow sounds. Natalie and Dante switched back to Portuguese this time, faster and more fluid, as if Graham's presence had completely faded. They spoke about timing, about needing just a little more patience, about how everything would unfold smoothly, as long as no one stepped out of line. Graham understood every word. He heard the contempt and the dangerous confidence of people who believed they were in control of another man's fate. In that moment, Graham no longer felt pain. The sting of betrayal receded, replaced by something colder and sharper: calculation. He had faced life or death decisions before, had chosen courses for ships in the middle of violent storms. Compared to those moments, this dinner was calm water on the surface, with a lethal current underneath. And Graham knew that one wrong reaction would pull the ship of his life straight down. Natalie lifted her glass and lightly touched it to Dante's. A small gesture, quick enough that others might miss it, but to Graham it rang as clear as a silent oath. He set his cutlery down, wiped his mouth, and smiled the smile of a gentle, slightly outdated man trying to keep up with his wife's world. Natalie returned the look with satisfaction. She believed she was still in control. But as Graham stood and pulled her chair back, he leaned in just enough to hear her breathing. In that instant, a single thought echoed clearly in his mind. If this was a game of chess, his opponents had just made their first mistake. They thought he did not understand. They thought he was weak. They thought his time was over. Graham walked out of the restaurant with Natalie and Dante, the sea wind striking his face, carrying the familiar scent of salt. He inhaled deeply, letting the cold awaken an old instinct. Tonight he would continue playing the underestimated husband. But from this moment on, every move would be his to calculate. And when the hidden current finally surged to the surface, no one would know who had truly been at the helm. The next morning, Graham opened a drawer he had not touched in years, and in just a few seconds, the world Natalie had carefully built began to crack from the inside. The house was as quiet as it was every morning. Pale gray light slipped through the kitchen curtains and settled on the wooden table where they had shared coffee for decades. Natalie had left early, citing a strategic meeting, her voice brisk and cheerful, her kiss on Graham's cheek, automatic and empty. When the door closed behind her, Graham stood still for a long moment, listening to the silence, a heavy silence that slowed his heartbeat, steadying it, cooling it. He did not rush. Graham had never been impulsive. During his years at the port, he learned that the worst decisions were made in panic. Instead, he brewed coffee and drank it in small sips, letting memory and instinct guide him. Then he walked into the room Natalie called her home, office a space so perfectly organized it felt sterile, every item aligned clean, emotionless, too perfect. Graham started with the obvious places. The top drawer held work documents, contracts, glossy brochures. Nothing unusual. The second drawer contained household bills and tax papers. Graham skimmed them quickly, his eyes trained on numbers and patterns. Still nothing. Then he reached the bottom drawer, the one most people forget. Beneath a stack of logistics magazines lay a thin folder with no label, no title. When Graham opened it, he stopped breathing. Inside were bank statements, not from their joint account, but from an account solely in Natalie's name. The deposits were regular, methodical, the amounts clean and rounded, as if calculated long in advance. Graham sat down slowly. His back remained straight, but his hands began to tremble. He flipped through the pages month by month. The deposits appeared precisely during the periods when Natalie had complained about financial strain, when she said she needed extra capital to protect her position, to avoid being pushed aside. Graham remembered nodding, signing, believing. Another memory surfaced, sharp and unforgiving. This house, the one he inherited from his father. The house Natalie once called a dormant asset, insisting money should be put to work instead of sitting still. She had convinced him to refinance it, saying it was for their shared future. Graham stood and crossed into his own study, opened the small safe hidden behind a bookshelf, and pulled out an old file. Loan documents, his signature, and Natalie's side by side. He checked the dates. Every loan matched perfectly with the transfers into that secret account. This was not carelessness. This was a plan. A cold wave ran down Graham's spine. He was no longer just a betrayed husband. He was a piece on a board placed there long ago, moved slowly and deliberately by hands that believed he was too dull to notice. Natalie had not only deceived his heart, she had deceived his entire life. His phone vibrated. Graham flinched, then steadied his breath. It was the bank. A familiar, polite voice confirmed recent transactions and asked whether Natalie held full authorization. Graham answered calmly, briefly. When the call ended, he stared into the empty space before him, and in that moment, one thing became unmistakably clear. Natalie was not acting alone. Graham thought of Dante, of the way he spoke about growth, about shipping routes, about massive profits. He thought of the confidence of a man unafraid of scrutiny. The pieces began to lock together, forming a picture far darker than a simple affair. This was money. This was power. And possibly something far dirtier. Graham closed the folder and returned it exactly where he found it, leaving no trace. He understood the value of remaining undiscovered. To Natalie and Dante, he was still the man growing weaker, slower, easier to guide. They believed they controlled the pace, and Graham would let them keep believing that. He returned to the kitchen, poured more coffee, and stared out at the small garden behind the house. The apple tree he planted when they first moved in had grown tall, its roots deep and firm. Graham realized he was the same. He had been buried under other people's underestimation for far too long, but his roots were still there, and when the time came, Those roots would tear down everything Natalie and Dante believed was unshakable. What came next would require patience, precision, and a cold mind. Graham was ready. This was no longer the story of a betrayed husband. It was the moment he began taking his life back. Applause erupted across the lavish hall, and in that instant, Graham understood that he had just been turned into a spectacle in front of an entire circle of power. The Northbridge Gala unfolded in a glittering space overlooking the bay. Crystal chandeliers cast light over expensive suits and elegant evening gowns. Natalie appeared as the image of success, moving with confidence, smiling brightly, her hand lightly resting on Dante's arm. She introduced Graham as her retired husband, her voice gentle, but unconsciously reducing him to a supporting extra in her story of professional ascent. Graham stood beside her, back straight expression, calm, wearing that role like a necessary coat. Dante stepped onto the stage microphone, in hand, his voice strong and assured. He spoke a vision of expanding shipping routes, of a brilliant future ahead. Then, with a calculated turn, he glanced toward Graham and joked that behind every successful female leader, there was a husband who knew when to step back. Laughter rippled through the room. Natalie laughed as well, tilting her head slightly in agreement. Graham felt it clearly. This was not just humor. It was public humiliation, carefully wrapped in polished civility. In the crowd, curious eyes swept over. Graham judged him in seconds and moved on. To them, he was an outdated man, out of sync with a world driven by speed and money. But Graham remained still, letting silence do its work. He remembered holding steady in storms, making decisions when hundreds of lives depended on a single command. Compared to those moments, this laughter was only wind brushing across a ship's deck. Natalie turned to Graham and gently squeezed his hand, whispering that she knew he disliked events like this, but this was a major opportunity. Graham nodded. In her eyes he saw satisfaction, the belief that he had accepted his place. Dante continued his speech, raised a toast, and the applause swelled again. Graham clapped along slow and even careful not to reveal the shift in his heartbeat. When the evening eased, Graham separated from Natalie and Dante and moved toward the bar. He needed air, he needed to observe. That was when a young voice spoke behind him, quiet but firm. "Mr. Pierce?" "Right." Graham turned to see a young woman, her face tense, eyes alert. She introduced herself as Lena from the shipping route analysis team. Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anger held in too long. Lena spoke quickly, as if afraid of being overheard. She said the numbers did not add up. Routes were looping unnecessarily. Vendors existed only on paper. When she asked questions, her superiors told her to stop digging. After tonight, she suspected she would no longer have a place in the company. Graham listened, his gaze sharpening. What Lena described matched the money flows he had already discovered at home. The pieces began to align on their own. From across the room, Natalie noticed Graham speaking with Lena. A flicker of irritation crossed her face too fast for others to see. Dante noticed as well. He watched his smile unchanged, but his eyes cooled. In Dante's mind, every risk had to be controlled, and variables like Lena were meant to be eliminated. Lena slipped a small memory card into Graham's hand. She said nothing more, only held his gaze. "I do not know what kind of man you are," she said softly, "but I believe you are not like them." Then she turned and disappeared into the crowd before anyone could take notice. Graham closed his fingers around the card. A familiar sensation rose within him, the feeling of standing at a major crossroads where every choice carried a cost. The gala ended with congratulations and fading lights. Natalie linked her arm through Graham's, chatting excitedly about Dante's success and the bright future ahead. Graham listened, but his mind was elsewhere. He understood now that the humiliation had not been accidental. It was a message. They believed he had been placed where he belonged, neutralized. As the car pulled away from the harbor, Graham looked out at the dark water city lights, stretching into trembling lines across its surface. One truth settled firmly inside him. That gala had not only been a display of their power, it had also been the signal for him to act. And this time, he was no longer alone. The call came that afternoon, and with just a few words, Graham understood that Natalie had already begun writing a different story about him, one in which he was no longer a clear-minded man. The voice of their family doctor came through the phone, familiar yet cautious. He asked whether Graham had been feeling more tired lately, whether he was still experiencing brief chest pains, as Natalie had mentioned during the last appointment. Graham stood motionless in the kitchen, pale light falling across his face, and in that moment, everything became painfully clear. Natalie had told the doctor that he was weakening, that his memory was no longer what it used to be, that there were things he could not remember. Graham answered slowly and calmly, denying every symptom, but the hesitation on the other end of the line did not fade. The doctor referred to notes already placed in the file comments about mild decline and the need for closer monitoring. When the call ended, Graham set the phone down his hand, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from anger. He sat down and closed his eyes, letting memory rewind. Natalie had once been genuinely worried about him. In the early years after the port accident, she stayed by his side every night, helping him relearn how to walk, how to sleep, how to live at a slower pace. At some point, that concern had turned into a tool. At some point, love had become strategy. Graham opened his eyes, understanding now that Natalie was not only manipulating his finances and reputation, she was manipulating the way others perceived his mind. That evening, Natalie came home wearing her usual gentle expression. She asked if he had forgotten lunch, if he remembered to take his medication. Her voice was soft, her eyes attentive. To an outsider, she would have looked like a devoted wife, caring for her husband. Graham watched every small movement, the way she typed something into her phone, after asking an innocent question, the way she repeated the same information twice, as if testing his response. It was a subtle examination disguised as affection. Natalie believed Graham did not notice. She believed he had slowed down enough to miss these details. But Graham had managed systems far more complex than this. He had seen disasters unfold from a single number falling out of rhythm. Now he could see the pattern clearly. Natalie was building a file, a consistent narrative of a man gradually losing control of himself. That night, Graham did not sleep. He sat in his study beneath the desk lamp and wrote everything down. The moments Natalie said he was forgetful, the times she mentioned his health to others, the doctor's call. He wrote in steady handwriting like a man logging a voyage before a storm. This was no longer an emotional reaction. This was data collection. The next morning, Graham went to the clinic on his own without telling Natalie. He sat across from the doctor, met his gaze, and spoke clearly about his former work, the projects he once ran, the decisions he had made. He answered every memory test accurately, without hurry. He asked to review his medical file. The doctor hesitated. In those notes, Graham saw Natalie's fingerprints, second-hand reports observations without direct evidence. When Graham left the clinic, doubt was gone. Natalie had gone much further than he imagined. This was not just an affair, not just money or power. It was a quiet campaign to strip him of credibility, to turn him into a man whose words would no longer matter. And once a man is seen as mentally unreliable, everything he says can be dismissed. That afternoon, Graham met Lena again at a small, discreet coffee shop. She looked more exhausted, her eyes tight with strain. She told him her manager had called her in, asked why she spoke with Graham at the gala, warned her to focus on her work and stop paying attention to things outside her scope. It was a warning. Graham listened and nodded. Two underestimated people sat across from each other, each holding a piece of the truth. When Graham returned home, it was already dark. Natalie was not there. He stood in the living room and looked around the familiar space, realizing something cold and certain. If he did nothing, the story Natalie was writing about him would soon become reality in the eyes of everyone else. But Graham had never allowed anyone to steer his ship for long. He had read the map. He knew where the hidden currents were. What came next would be more dangerous. But this time, Graham was no longer alone in his clarity, and most importantly, he finally understood the game Natalie was playing. The cafe door closed behind Graham, and in that moment, he understood that from now on, there was no way back. Mason Grant was sitting at a table in the far corner, his back to the wall, eyes scanning the room out of pure habit. He looked older than Graham remembered, more gray in his hair, but the presence was the same, the calm of a man long accustomed to operating in the gray zones where one wrong step costs everything. When Graham sat down, Mason did not ask how he was, did not exchange pleasantries. He looked straight into his old friend's eyes and said a single sentence, "You are being hunted." Graham was not surprised. He told Mason everything: the harbor dinner, the Portuguese conversation, the secret bank account, the distorted medical records. Mason listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting a word or two in a thin notebook. When Graham finished, the cafe buzzed around them, but between the two men, the air felt dense and still. Mason closed the notebook and spoke evenly. "This is not just an affair. This is preparation to erase you." The words struck something Graham had not yet dared to name. Mason continued, his voice cold and precise. "The money you found is not just dirty money. It needs cover. And the best cover is making the one person who could expose it seem unreliable. Once a man is labeled mentally declining, every warning he gives is dismissed." Graham clenched his fist. He understood. Natalie and Dante were not trying to remove him from a marriage, they were trying to remove him from the narrative entirely. Mason asked Graham what he wanted: not revenge, but an ending. Graham answered without hesitation, "I want the truth seen, and I want to stay alive." Mason nodded. "Then we move fast, but quieter than them." They started with Lena. Mason had already done a preliminary check, and her suspicions were grounded. Looping shipping routes, vendors that existed only on paper commissions, cycling back into shell entities. Mason explained that federal agencies paid close attention to schemes like this, especially when cross-border transport was involved. Graham listened, realizing the scale of the game was far larger than he first imagined. This was no longer a family matter. It was a machine. Natalie called Graham while they were still talking. Her name lit up the screen. Graham looked at Mason. Mason shook his head slightly. "Do not change your tone," Graham answered. Natalie asked if he was home, if he remembered what they planned for dinner. Her voice was soft and familiar. Graham stayed in character, said he felt a little tired and might turn in early. Natalie expressed just enough concern. Mason watched closely, eyes narrowing. "She is checking you," he said after the call ended. Mason laid out the plan step by step. No confrontation, no public accusations. First, solid evidence legally obtained with no exposed sources. Lena would need protection, but she would have to accept risk. Graham would continue playing the role of the slowing husband, so Natalie would believe her campaign was working. Every phone call, every question about memory, every reminder to take medication would be documented. Graham nodded. He did not like pretending to be weak, but he understood the cost of patience. Mason studied him for a long moment. "People think power is speaking loud, standing on a stage," he said. but real power is when you make your opponent believe you have none. Graham smiled faintly. That was something he had done his entire life. That evening, Graham returned home on time. Natalie was already there, cooking soft music playing. She asked about his day. Graham answered vaguely, deliberately, forgetting one small detail. Natalie nodded, her eyes flickering with brief satisfaction before she masked it. In her mind, the story of a declining husband gained another piece. In Graham's mind, every reaction Natalie showed slid neatly into place. As night settled, Graham lay staring at the ceiling. He thought about who he had been and who he now had to pretend to be. The two versions did not clash. They complemented each other. He had not lost his strength. He had only hidden it. Elsewhere, Natalie texted Dante, telling him everything was progressing well, that Graham was weaker than she expected. Dante replied briefly, instructing her to continue as planned. They both believed time was on their side. They did not know that in the darkness, another current had already begun to flow, slow, precise, and impossible to reverse. The meeting was set in a short message, and the location alone told Graham that Dante had decided to step out of the shadows. The bar sat high in an old hotel, dim lights and slow music creating a false sense of privacy. Graham arrived early and chose a seat tucked away, his back to the wall, old instincts returning without effort. When Dante walked in, he carried his usual confidence-tailored suit, polite smile, as if this were nothing more than a harmless social meeting. But his eyes told a different story, sharp, cold, no longer hiding. Dante sat across from Graham and ordered a drink without asking. He studied Graham for a moment, as though deciding where to begin, then smiled faintly and said he had always admired men who knew when to let go. The words were delivered calmly, but their weight was heavy. Graham did not respond. He met Dante's gaze, his own calm so steady it caused the other man to pause for a fraction of a second. Dante continued, lowering his voice, making it sound intimate. Natalie was exhausted, he said. She had carried too much for too long, the job, the responsibility, and the burden of caring for a husband who was no longer as strong as he used to be. Every word was chosen carefully, every pause deliberate. This was not casual talk. It was psychological pressure, an offer wrapped in pity. Graham felt heat rise in his chest, but his expression did not change. He thought of Mason, of the warning not to react, not to reveal anything. Dante interpreted the silence in his own way. He leaned forward slightly and spoke more softly. There were ways for things to end smoothly, he said. Divorce did not have to be loud, especially when one party was no longer fully capable of seeing it through. In that moment, every layer of pretense fell away. Graham heard what he had prepared himself to hear, and still felt a chill along his spine. Dante was suggesting that Graham would not only lose his wife, but also the right to decide his own fate, that the paperwork was already in place, that the story of cognitive decline was solid enough to stand before anyone. Graham set his glass down slow and deliberate, then looked up and asked evenly what Dante was talking about. Dante smiled the smile of a man convinced he held the advantage. He said he only wanted to spare Graham unnecessary stress. At this age, emotional shocks could be dangerous. The heart, the memory, those things were more fragile than people realized. In that instant, Graham saw Dante for what he truly was, not a polished executive or a romantic partner, but a predator who used fear as leverage. He understood that this was no longer a vague threat. A line had been crossed. Dante pulled a thin envelope from his jacket and slid it across the table. Inside were copies of documents, a divorce filing, unfavorable terms, and a handwritten note referring to Graham's health. Dante did not explain. He did not need to. If Graham signed, everything would move quickly. If he did not, the story of an unstable man would continue to spread. Graham did not touch the envelope. He looked at Dante without fear, only the cold focus of someone who had passed the point of return and asked a single question whether Natalie knew about this. Dante laughed, no longer hiding anything, and asked Graham what he thought. The answer did not need to be spoken. Graham straightened his jacket with the neat precision of a man ending a pointless meeting, and said he would think about it. Dante nodded, satisfied, telling him he had time, but not much, because Natalie would soon want everything resolved. As Graham stepped out into the night, the cold wind struck his face, sharp and clarifying. His hand tightened in his pocket, empty the envelope left behind on the table. He did not need it. He already had something far more important: confirmation. Dante had just removed his own mask, and by doing so, had stepped deeper into a trap that was quietly closing. Somewhere else, Natalie was waiting for a message, confident Dante would handle everything, certain Graham would accept his place. She did not know that in that dark bar, a boundary had been crossed, and from that moment on, the game had shifted. Lena was called into the Human Resources office early the next morning, and when she walked out with her face drained of color, Graham knew the gears had begun grinding harder. Her message came through short and blunt. "They let me go," effective immediately. Graham felt a chill run up his spine as he read it. This was no longer a warning. This was removal. Clean and decisive, exactly Dante's style, and a clear signal that their timeline was tightening. That evening, Graham met Mason in a small back room behind Mason's old office. No sign outside, no visible cameras, only dim yellow light and the smell of old paper. Mason listened to the news about Lena without surprise and nodded slowly. "Wrongful termination," he said, "and they just made a mistake. Firing someone who raised questions right after a gala was a trace far too obvious." Graham stayed silent, but inside him rose a strange feeling, not fear, but responsibility. Lena had stepped out of the shadows because of him, because she believed he was different. He could not let her be sacrificed and erased. Mason saw it in his eyes and said Lena would be protected, but the price was going deeper, moving faster, and accepting greater risk. The plan took shape over the table, no dramatic notes, just short, precise sentences. Mason would activate old contacts in compliance and investigation circles. The files Lena provided would be sent through legal anonymous channels impossible to trace back. Graham would continue playing the role of the husband who was slowing down, even allowing Natalie to believe her strategy was working perfectly. Back home, Graham performed his part carefully. He forgot a small appointment, mixed up an unimportant detail. Natalie observed, recorded it, and the confidence in her eyes grew noticeably. She asked if he felt tired, if his heart raced. Graham answered vaguely. Natalie nodded, a flicker of satisfaction passing like a small victory. That night, Graham quietly installed the devices Mason had brought, small, silent, legal. A recorder in the living room, a camera angled toward the kitchen, where Natalie often prepared tea and organized medication. Every movement was slow and exact, like walking a ship's deck through heavy fog. He did not shake, he focused. Elsewhere, Natalie texted Dante telling him Graham was forgetting more, that he seemed tired and easy to guide. Dante replied quickly, telling her to keep the pace and not rush, but beneath the words, Graham could sense impatience creeping in. When a predator grows anxious, it means the prey is no longer standing still. The next day, Lena called Graham, her voice hoarse from exhaustion and strain. She said the company had taken her computer, locked her access, and hinted that if she caused trouble, they would claim she was mentally unstable. Graham closed his eyes. The same script, the same tactic, only now he could see the whole picture. Mason arranged for Lena to meet a labor attorney quietly. No press, just a file submitted in the right place at the right time. A small needle piercing a thick shell. Graham knew they were forcing the other side to react, and in reacting, they would leave more traces. Natalie began to change. She grew gentler, more attentive, a calculated tenderness. She brewed new teas for Graham and reminded him to take his medication on schedule. Every gesture was captured on camera, every word preserved. Graham felt one thing with clarity. Natalie was no longer just controlling the story about him. She was preparing for an ending. Graham lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Natalie's steady breathing beside him. This woman had once been his safest place. Now she was the center of a tightening web of lies. Yet instead of despair, Graham felt an unexpected calm. He had passed beyond fear. Across the city, Mason reviewed the first data being sent out, looping routes, shell vendors' commissions cycling back into hidden accounts. The pieces connected like a living diagram. Mason allowed himself a thin smile. When a machine begins to reveal its own structure, its collapse is not far off. Graham knew the next phase would be the most dangerous, but he also knew that from the moment Lena was fired, the game no longer belonged to Natalie and Dante. They had gone too far, and when a predator loses patience, that is when the trap snaps shut the fastest. Natalie set the teacup down on the table with a gentle smile, and in that moment, Graham knew this night was no longer a rehearsal. The herbal scent drifted softly through the living room, warm and sweet, like a familiar lullaby. Natalie stood by the kitchen, back straight movements, precise stirring with steady rhythm. She spoke about a tea that was good for circulation, said the doctor had once recommended it for people who tired easily. Her voice was velvet smooth. Graham nodded and moved slowly to the armchair, fully inhabiting the role of the husband growing weaker by the day. In his mind, Mason's instructions rang clearly: drink half-weight long enough, do not rush. Natalie handed the cup to Graham with both hands. Her eyes lingered on his face, measuring his breathing, his color, his reactions. Graham took a small sip. The bitterness hit his tongue beneath the chamomile aroma. He winced slightly, just enough for Natalie to notice. She tilted her head and asked if something was wrong. Graham shook his head and said he was just a little tired. Natalie smiled the smile of someone convinced everything was moving exactly as planned. Time slowed, as if the clock itself had been held back. On the shelf, the old clock ticked steadily. Graham counted the beats one by one, until a mild heat spread through his chest, the manufactured response Mason had prepared. He set the cup down his hand, trembling just a little. Natalie noticed immediately. She stepped closer, placed a hand on his shoulder, and asked if his heart was racing. Graham breathed deeply and said he felt uncomfortable. That was enough. Natalie pulled out her phone and turned away a few steps. Graham heard the tapping of keys, heard her voice drop. He did not need to hear the words to know who she was speaking to. In Natalie's mind, the picture was complete. The tea consumed the symptoms appearing. All that remained was patience. She returned, touched Graham's forehead, and told him he should lie down and rest. Graham stood and walked slowly toward the bedroom, shoulders slightly hunched, breaths shorter. Each step was another brushstroke in the portrait they intended to hang over his life. Graham lay back on the bed. The bedside lamp cast a soft glow. Natalie sat beside him, asking the familiar questions: chest pain, shortness of breath. Graham answered in broken phrases. Then he let the staged pain surge. He curled inward, clutching his chest, a sharp groan escaping him. Natalie rose quickly, but not in panic. She took her phone and dialed clearly, stating that her husband was having a heart episode. Her voice trembled just enough. Enough for the script. While Natalie spoke to emergency services, Graham heard a message alert, short and crisp. Natalie turned her back and replied quickly. Graham knew it was Dante. He heard her murmur that everything was unfolding as planned. Then she ended the call, returned to the bed, and took Graham's hand. Her hand was cold. Her eyes shone with something strange, part worry, part anticipation. Graham relaxed his body and let his breathing slow. He remembered Mason's words at this point. Stop reacting, let the body go still. Let the story finish its course. Natalie leaned down, pressed her ear to his chest. She counted. 1, 2. Then she lifted her head. For a brief instant, the softness vanished from her face. There was only relief, like someone setting down a heavy burden. The ambulance siren sounded in the distance. Natalie wiped her tears, inhaled deeply, adjusted her hair. By the time the medics entered, she was ready. She spoke clearly, describing recent forgetfulness fatigue, the sudden pain. She cried, but did not break. She performed the role of the devoted wife to the very end. Graham lay still listening as everything flowed past him like water. They lifted him onto the stretcher. Bright white light brushed his eyelids. Natalie followed a few steps, then stopped saying she would come after. As the doors closed, Graham heard her make another call. Her voice dropped to a whisper, saying he was no longer responding, that everything was fine. The vehicle moved. Inside, Graham opened his eyes just a fraction. Mason was there, nodding once. Everything had been recorded, every word, every breath. Graham closed his eyes again and let the silence settle. He did not feel triumph. He felt only a calm certainty. Tonight they believed he had disappeared, and that belief would lead them straight into the light they feared most. The news spread faster than the ambulance siren, and within a single morning, Natalie became the most pitied widow in the quiet conversations of the elite. She sat in the living room, wearing a dark robe, eyes red from crying, her voice rough with grief. Friends and acquaintances came one by one, placing hands on her shoulder, whispering familiar condolences. Natalie nodded, offered sad smiles, and told the story she had rehearsed to perfection. Graham had been forgetful lately. Graham had been tired. Graham had suffered a sudden heart attack in the middle of the night. Every detail flowed naturally like a true memory, and no one questioned it. Dante arrived around midday, carrying just the right amount of sorrow on his face. When they were finally alone, he held Natalie longer than necessary, and whispered that it was all over now. Natalie closed her eyes and released a quiet breath of relief. In her mind, one chapter had ended. No more slow husband, no more silent, watchful eyes, only freedom power and a future purchased with the silence of a dead man. Somewhere else, Graham sat up on a cold metal bed inside a sealed room. White light washed over his face, revealing real exhaustion, not an act. Mason stood nearby, checking the equipment one last time. Everything was recorded, Mason said. Not a word missed, not a single gesture lost. Graham nodded, feeling his heartbeat settle. He felt no joy, only lightness, as if a weight he had carried for too long had finally been set down. When Natalie signed the first documents as the sole beneficiary, her hand did not shake. She asked the lawyer about insurance timelines and asset transfers. She cried when necessary and stayed silent when appropriate. Everything moved smoothly, too smoothly, and that smoothness began to draw the attention of people who were not fooled by tears. Mason initiated the next phase. The files that had been sent out quietly began landing on the right desks. Questions appeared polite at first, carefully worded. One investigator asked about looping shipping routes. Another asked about vendors without physical addresses. No accusations yet, only questions that demanded answers. Dante sensed the shift before Natalie did. He started making more calls, his voice tighter, his instructions sharper. Natalie, however, still believed everything was under control. She believed Graham had been removed from the equation. She believed the story of a declining husband had been accepted. Then one gray afternoon, two men in dark suits stood at her door and introduced themselves as federal investigators. They asked if they could speak with her about the night Graham died. Natalie welcomed them in maintaining her measured sorrow. She answered smoothly until they asked about the tea she prepared that evening. Her eyes flickered just for a moment, but long enough for trained observers to notice. When they asked why she called another number before contacting emergency services, she paused a second too long. Dante had warned her to be careful, but no one prepares for being examined from every angle. In the sealed room, Graham watched footage of Natalie embracing Dante after the ambulance left. He did not turn away. He watched directly, letting the pain pass through him one final time. Mason stood beside him in silence, knowing words were unnecessary. That afternoon, Dante was called in for questioning. The next day, search warrants followed. Computers were seized, accounts were frozen. The pieces Lena had once touched were now placed under bright lights, and the machine began to tremble. Natalie did not realize the truth when investigators returned a second time. She realized it when Dante stopped answering his phone, when her lawyer began speaking cautiously, when the people around her looked at her differently with suspicion. Graham stood by the window, watching the sky shift into sunset. He knew the next step would be public the moment he stepped out of the shadows, but not yet. There was no need to rush. The prey still believed the hunter was dead, and that belief would make the final reversal impossible to stop. The meeting room doors burst open, and in a single second, the world Natalie had struggled to keep balanced for weeks collapsed completely. She stood up on instinct when the men in dark suits walked in, but this time there was no polite request, no gentle questioning, only firm voices reading each word, each charge with precision. The sound hit the room like a hammer striking stone. Conspiracy to poison financial fraud, manipulation of medical records, obstruction of a federal investigation. Natalie felt the blood drain from her face as every carefully arranged plan shattered inside her mind. She searched for Dante with her eyes, but the chair beside her was empty. Dante had not come. He had chosen to protect himself first. In that moment, Natalie understood a bitter truth: she had never been the one in control. She had only been a tool. Across the city, in a brightly lit room, Graham stood motionless in front of a screen, watching Natalie, the woman who had once been his wife, in handcuffs, her voice breaking as she tried to argue. He felt no triumph, no glorious victory, only a deep, heavy sadness, like water slowly receding at the bottom of a river. Mason stood beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder, saying it was time. Graham took a long breath. He had known this moment would come the moment he stepped out of the shadows, not for revenge, but to end the story with the truth. The press conference took place that afternoon, camera flashes exploding like lightning, questions fired rapidly, curious and suspicious eyes filling the room. When Graham appeared, the room fell silent in a single breath. The man they believed was dead was standing there, posture straight, eyes calm. A few gasps escaped. A few people stepped back as if seeing a ghost. Graham did not speak immediately. He stood still and let silence do its work. Then he spoke slowly and clearly, telling everything, no more, no less, from the first signs to the way his medical records were altered to the night, with the teacup that seemed harmless. He spoke with the voice of a man who had seen betrayal at its deepest point, but refused to let it turn him bitter. Reporters scribbled furiously as Mason raised his hand to stop the questions. All evidence had been submitted, every recording, every image, every message. There was no room left for speculation, no space left for doubt. In a temporary holding cell, Natalie sat alone with her hands tightly clasped. When she heard that Graham was still alive, she did not cry. She let out a soft laugh, a broken smile without tears. She remembered the moments Graham had been silent, the times he looked at her for a long while. She had thought that was weakness. Now she understood it had been patience. Dante was arrested that same evening at a small airport. He did not escape. Accounts were frozen. Partners turned away. The man who once stood confidently on stage now lowered his head before cameras, his sharp words gone replaced by the emptiness of someone who had underestimated his opponent. Graham returned home after dark. The house was unnaturally quiet. No sound of Natalie's footsteps, no familiar perfume in the air. He walked slowly through each room, touching the walls, as if to confirm he was truly there, truly alive. He stopped at the window and looked out at the garden, moonlight falling over the beds they had once tended together. Part of it was painful memory, part of a life that had closed. Graham did not erase the past, he simply placed it where it belonged. There was no anger left inside him, only a deep stillness. He had been underestimated, dismissed as slow, treated as a man without power, yet that very judgment had given him time-space and his greatest advantage. The truth had finally been spoken, and in that moment, Graham understood that victory was not about who fell, but about preserving himself when everything else collapsed. The final message arrived just as dawn touched the edge of the window, and a single short line was enough for Graham to know the story had truly ended. The sentence had been handed down. No appeals, no hidden deals. The names that once stood on stages of power were now read in another room, colder and quieter. Graham stood still as morning light filled the kitchen, the place where everything had begun, with a teacup that once seemed harmless. He did not smile, and he did not feel heavy, only a slow spreading sense of relief, like the air after a storm has passed. The house no longer felt the same, not because the furniture had changed, but because the atmosphere had. Graham opened the windows and let the wind carry in the scent of damp earth and leaves. He made coffee slowly and carefully, a new kind of ritual. No one reminded him to take medication. No one tested his memory. No one wrote his story for him anymore. In the city, those who once laughed quietly behind his back now spoke in different tones. Some were surprised, some ashamed, some avoided his eyes when they crossed paths. Graham did not need apologies, and he did not need recognition. The truth had found its own way forward without being pushed. Mason stopped by around midday. They sat on the porch and spoke very little. The big events were over, leaving behind the calm silence of people who knew they had walked through danger together. Mason mentioned that Lena had received a new offer somewhere safer and more transparent. Graham nodded, knowing that one small piece had been saved and that mattered more than praise. After Mason left, Graham remained alone. He walked through the garden and touched the soil. Some things had died, others were just beginning to grow. Life did not need drama to continue. It only needed truth and time. That evening, Graham sat at the table and opened an old notebook. He wrote not to claim credit and not to accuse, but to remember how close he had come to losing everything and what he had managed to keep. He wrote about being underestimated, dismissed, pushed to the edge of his own story, and about the strange strength of patience, of watching, of not reacting when the world expects you to fall. Somewhere else, Natalie began a series of identical days. No meetings, no lights, only time. Dante faded from headlines and slipped into files no one wanted to revisit. Power once stripped away turned out to be far more fragile than either of them had believed. Graham closed the notebook. He did not know where he would go next, maybe a distant trip, maybe a quieter life, but this time, every choice was his. No one stood behind him writing the script. No one pulled the curtain. He turned off the light and left the room in gentle darkness. Before stepping outside, Graham paused for a moment and thought of everyone who had ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or misjudged. He knew that feeling well, and he knew that sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage if you are calm enough to wait. Graham's story ends here, but its meaning does not. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment and share where you are watching from. And if you would like to hear more stories like this, let your support be known. Sometimes, a story shared at the right moment can become a light for someone standing in the dark.